Good afternoon and happy Equality Day. I'd like to welcome you to our lunchtime discussion entitled She Persisted, Votes for Women in Indiana, Monroe County, and at Indiana University. So happy you're joining us today as we commemorate the 100-year anniversary of the 19th Amendment. Today was the day it was certified after Tennessee ratified it last week, 100 years ago. So today's panel is a part of a larger Equality Day series. We had a student panel on Monday. You could go back and listen to that great recording. We have today's noontime panel, and we have a Friday panel as well about women's power. So be sure to tune into that. Also today at 5 p.m., Anita Morgan, author of this wonderful book, We Must Be Fearless, the women's suffrage movement in Indiana. She will be speaking and telling stories about the Indiana suffrage movement, and you don't want to miss that. So tune into this same place for that at 5 p.m. today. She will be giving our keynote address. So we are here to commemorate voting rights and discuss it through a local lens. So it should be a wonderful time together. I want to thank the IU Arts and Humanities Council who helped to make this happen. It's such a great team of folks to work with. Also, our other co-sponsors, so grateful for, the Office of the Provost, the Democracy Themester, Department of History, and the Political and Civic Engagement Program. So I'm Lisa Marie Napoli. I'm Director of the Political and Civic Engagement Program, and I'm honored to be with you today. So as we move into our panel discussion, I just want to take a moment for us to catch our breath, to commemorate this special day, and to acknowledge and honor the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee people on whose ancestral homelands and resources IU was built on. So I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator today, Wendy Gamber. Wendy Gamber is Robert F. Burns Professor in History and Chair of the IU History Department. Her research focuses on the ways in which women navigated the working and business worlds. She's the author of 3 books, The Female Economy, The Millinery and Dressmaking Trades, 1860 to 1903, The Boarding House in 19th Century America, and most recently, The Notorious Mrs. Clem, Murder and Money in the Gilded Age. Welcome and take it over, Wendy.
All right. Thank you, Lisa Marie, for your kind introduction. And I'm delighted to be here to moderate this conversation, and I'm excited to hear what you're all going to say. So, as Lisa Marie noted, 100 years ago today, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution was signed into law, and it reads, "The rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." We've often been encouraged to think of the 19th Amendment as the result or the accomplishment of the work of a small number of national leaders, most commonly Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, sometimes Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul. But we need to remember that the suffrage movement was a movement. And it was one of the many forms of activism in which ordinary women and some men in all parts of the nation engaged. When we look closely at what was happening in Indiana, including right here in Monroe County and at Indiana University, we find a history that's much richer and much more interesting than the standard story many of us may have previously been told. And that's what we're going to hear about today. So we have 5 wonderful panelists: Dina Kellams, Hilary Fleck, Jazma Sutton, Janine Giordano Drake, and Lisa Marie Napoli, who you've just met. So our first speaker will be Dina Kellams, Director of IU Libraries University Archives. Dina first joined the archives as a graduate student intern in 1999, and I'm proud to say that she received her BA from the IU History Department. Dina's research interests include Indiana University history, student life, and teaching with primary sources. She presents regularly to campus and community groups about IU history and is a contributing author to Indiana University Bloomington, America's Legacy Campus. An updated edition of that book is underway. So without further ado, please welcome Dina Kellams.
Thank you so much, Wendy. And thank you all for having me here today. There is so much that I want to share with you about the suffrage movement on the Bloomington campus, but with 7 minutes, I've only got a little bit and I'm going to talk fast. I want to start with an introduction to the university archives. The mission of the University Archives is to collect, preserve, and make available university records with long-term value. In addition to the university records, which is definitely our bread and butter, we also collect the personal papers of IU faculty and alumni. With faculty, we like to document them as a member of the university community and as a scholar, and with alums, we like to document their time at Indiana University as a student. With those three large collecting areas, we have approximately, and it's really just a guesstimate, 18,000 cubic feet of papers and records in all formats. So paper, born digital, architectural drawings, audiovisual, photographs, basically you name it. If it's in a fixed format, we probably have it. With a collection of that size, our job as archivists is to connect researchers, and I use that term very loosely. That could be administrators, that could be student reporters, that could be family historians, or scholars from around the world. We work to connect those researchers with the best sources available for their work. And so a lot of what we learn about university history is just in the course of doing our job. So working with researchers, working on collections to make them available to researchers, or, yes, please, thank you for the slide, or working with donors or offices in the transfer of their records to the archives. And in the 20 plus years that I've been at the archives, I can only think of a couple of times when folks have come to me and asked me about the suffrage movement on campus. And unfortunately, it is not the case that I can be like, suffrage, let me grab that from the shelves and here's the collection. It's a much more involved process of identifying those collections where the suffrage movement might be represented, and then to just kind of dig in and see where that takes you. Next slide, please. And so that was what I was starting with today. What we did have was just a couple of newspaper clippings that archive staff had come across over the years that we thought, oh, this is interesting. This might be something that folks will be interested in seeing later on. Let me print this and throw it in a clippings file so it can be a good jumping off point at a later date. So that was my jumping off point. And where I jumped was to some of the historical newspapers, digitized newspaper databases that we have access to. The newspaper archive and newspapers.com are both subscription services, but if you're affiliated with Indiana University Bloomington, you have access to these through the IU libraries. The third one, the Hoosier State Chronicles, that is actually completely free, and that is run by the Indiana State Library. All three of these include some Bloomington papers, mostly 19th century, and in the case of newspapers.com and Hoosier State Chronicles, it's not much. Newspaper Archive actually also includes the IDS from its establishment in 1867 through 1923. They do not include any papers that are still in copyright, and even that coverage of the IDS is pretty spotty. But they do have several other Bloomington and Monroe County papers, and so it is a really wonderful resource if you are doing some research on Bloomington and Indiana University. Next slide, please. And it was in the Hoosier State Chronicles that I was able to locate an article about, it was just about Indiana University in general and some of the activities that were going on in a Terre Haute newspaper that talked about how Susan B. Anthony came to Bloomington in June 1870. Anthony was in the state for the Indiana Women's Suffrage Association convention that was held in Indianapolis. And while she was here, she traveled around and gave several addresses across the state, and including Bloomington. They note here that she lectured at City Hall on last Friday evening. So it was in town rather than on campus, but it was still of interest to me because town and gown were very much interconnected at this time period. But what I found really interesting in this article is not only the mention of Anthony, but the last sentence in that paragraph. We had had several lectures on this popular subject of late, and the people are becoming truly awake to its importance. So this isn't an article about Indiana University, but they are talking about Bloomington. So are they saying there were more lectures in town, or were there lectures on campus? Either way, I'm interested. I want to know what else was going on. But then that very last clip there, a women's rights association has been organized and commences labor with flattering prospects. So I, again, don't know if they're talking about a student organization on campus or a city organization. If it's a student organization, first, I've never heard of that on campus. And second, this would have been only 3 years after the first woman enrolled at Indiana University. So this female student body was still pretty small. This is fascinating. Maybe Hilary knows if this was a campus or a city organization or not. Either way, very interested. So next slide, please. So now I have a date of when Susan B. Anthony was in town. Now it's time to go back to our archival collections and see if that visit was represented at all. And indeed, I mentioned that we collect faculty papers and we document them as members of the university community and as scholars, but we also document them as people. They're people. And so we oftentimes get personal correspondence, photographs, diaries, and journals, and that was the case here. Theophilus Wiley was a longtime 19th century faculty member, and we have a wonderful collection of his papers in the archives. Wiley's name might sound familiar to you because he was the cousin of Andrew Wiley, IU's very first president. The collection of papers in the archives includes his writings, his research, but also his personal correspondence and his diaries. And he was a devoted diarist. And sure enough, in going to June 1870, and I don't expect you to be able to read this, his handwriting is challenging no matter what, but he wrote June 12th, 1870, Miss S.B. Anthony lectured on Friday night last, which would have been June 10th, created something of a sensation by her forcible way of presenting her cause. So I have confirmation that she was in Bloomington. He doesn't mention where she was, but I know that she was at City Hall. However, looking a little bit further down in that same journal, actually go back please, June 19th, there was another entry that says, Miss Anthony lectured again Friday night at the college chapel. Began late, kept on till 11 o'clock, tired all the people out, was rather prosy, and lost a good deal of the ground gained. This is a little different than what we read in the newspaper article, but Wiley, my impression of him is he wasn't a happy person, and if he had said anything nice, I think I would have been more shocked. Next slide, please. So with the time that I have, I just want to say that I think that the story is there. There is definitely evidence of interest in suffrage and the suffrage movement on the Bloomington campus. And just a little bit of work that I did, I was able to find evidence of the female students staging a walkout on election day in 1894. The Women's League that's pictured here, they frequently partnered with the Bloomington Women's Franchise League to bring prominent suffragists to campus for lectures in the 19-teens, including Emmeline Pankhurst, Anna Howard Shaw, Katrina Tiffany, and several others. So the stories are there. It was active on campus. We just need to dig in. Thank you.
Thanks, Dina. That was fabulous. So our next panelist is Hilary Fleck. Hilary is the collections manager at the Monroe County History Center, and Hilary is accompanied by her 1-month-old as well. So Hilary is a collection manager at the Monroe County History Center and a graduate of the University of Evansville and Indiana University with a master's degree in art history. She was awarded a May Wright Sewell Fellowship from Indiana Humanities to research local Monroe County suffragists and has developed an exhibition at the History Center presenting her original research. Hilary has a passion for local history and hopes that the suffragists she has uncovered help illustrate that anyone from any background can change their community for the better. So Hilary.
Thank you, Wendy. And thank you everyone for inviting me to this panel. I'm really excited to share the information that I've learned. When we at the History Center were looking forward to the 100th anniversary and what would the History Center do to help celebrate, we wanted to put together an exhibit, but we didn't have much information. In early 2019, the only suffragette we knew about was Maud Showers. She was a very wealthy white woman in the community and very influential in the 1800s and the early Bloomington and Monroe County communities. And so it was logical that we would know a lot about her, but we didn't know who else, anybody else, the extent of the movement in Monroe County. So I was really interested in finding that information so that we could continue to share that and really just highlight the fact that Monroe County was, even though it's not a large city like Indianapolis or Chicago at the time, we were still very much active in the suffrage movement, and that women here did care about that sort of movement. So I also want to say that my research was supported by the Indiana Humanities May Wright Sewell Fellowship. So thanks to them. And I was able to uncover, currently, I'm still working on research and moving past 1920 now to women who were the first women who were elected and ran for office, even unsuccessfully. So this fellowship supports that research and continuing that. So all of this come from that research. So next slide, please. So this was an article, my very first article that I found that helped me state my case and say that Monroe County and Bloomington specifically was a very important location in Indiana suffrage history. So this is from 1887. So in November of 1887, we hosted a National Women's Suffrage Association meeting. And we had Susan, this was yet another case of when Susan B. Anthony came to Bloomington to speak. And she was also accompanied by Mrs. May Wright Sewell, who was a very prominent Indianapolis suffragist. So even though she may not be as well known to us today, back then she was very well known as part of her philanthropy and causes that she supported. So I thought it was very interesting. So this meeting is taking place at the Walnut Street Presbyterian Church, which is no longer there, it burned down. And it's on the courthouse square is where it actually is. But it said in the article, every seat was filled. And I thought that was really, really showed the enthusiasm of the community. Kind of like Dina had mentioned in the journal entry from Wiley, that it's like, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of interest in the movement. So I think it was logical that we have a lot of activity, even though we just didn't know about it today. So that was part of my research, is to uncover these women. And very thankfully, at the end of the article, it mentions that Bloomington has had for several years a strong suffrage club. And I'm like, oh, really? Thank you. And then it very kindly names the people. So we found out right away that some of the officers of the club, and so that gave me a jumping off point to find these other women around the community. Next slide, please. So the article led me to other articles, just as research does. And so I was able to uncover that newspaper articles had stated that the Bloomington Equal Suffrage Club was founded in 1886, and that the first president was Mrs. Annabelle Miers. Her husband was a judge, so she was a very wealthy, prominent woman in the community at the time. And she often hosted the Equal Suffrage Club at her home, which I've still yet to find out where she lived in town, even though I do know it's on Walnut Street somewhere. But anyway, so she hosted a lot of suffrage clubs, and her husband, who in addition to being a lawyer, a judge, eventually became a representative, a state representative, and then a federal senator. So he moved through the political ranks himself. And he would often, he supported the movement, and he supported his wife's activities in the club, and would often speak at the club meetings and illustrate laws or discuss different sorts of legislations that were being proposed at the state legislature about suffrage. So he was very much supportive of the movement. Next slide, please. So a couple of the early women that I have uncovered is Mrs. Miers. She was actually the daughter of the second president of IU, which I thought was really wonderful. But she was, like I said, the founding president of the Bloomington Equal Suffrage Club. And then she and Mrs. Isabella Seward spoke often at other clubs and around the community and around the county. We have a couple of instances where she's traveled to Ellettsville to speak to their to clubs over there, and then just general audiences. There were speeches at parades, 4th of July parades, that sort of thing. So they did travel around the community and spread the word about suffrage. Mrs. Isabella Seward took it a step further. I have uncovered that she has traveled around the state. So she was actually the chairwoman of the executive committee of the Indiana State Suffrage Association. So she was at the state level rather than the specific Monroe County level, but that allowed her to travel around the state of Indiana and give speeches and help to establish other clubs in other communities. So that was really the early contribution of both of these women in the early 1800s or the later 1800s that are both from the community. Next slide, please. Agnes Evans was one that I uncovered, that she was in the kind of the later period of suffrage. So from about 1913 to 1920, suffrage activity picks up again in the community. And so she's a founding member of the Women's Franchise League of Bloomington, and then she becomes president of it in odd sorts of years. So she actually, one of the interesting things I found about Agnes, she's a graduate from IU with a degree in history, so hey. And then she organized this suffrage school. So women could come to this school, it's kind of like a retreat, and they would learn about how to campaign, how to give speeches, how to fundraise for suffrage, how to increase membership, all around the suffrage movement. So I thought that was very exciting. And next slide, please. And then Mrs. Joanna Johnson was also involved at the state level, and she was the secretary of the Legislative Council of Indiana Women, which helped draft the 1917 partial suffrage bill in Indiana, which was later struck down as being unconstitutional. But for a brief period in 1917, women could vote for special positions in Indiana, and Joanna was part of that movement. Next slide, please. Oh, so here I have just a general wrap up of the state legislature passed the resolution in 1920, and Indiana women and Monroe County women were involved at every level. So I was really excited to uncover these women and help share them through the exhibit. I have many more women that I unfortunately can't cover in 7 minutes, but it's really exciting, and I hope you can all come to the exhibit and learn about more women.
Thank you, Hilary. That was fascinating. So our next speaker is Jazma Sutton, who earned a BA in Africana Studies and History at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, and MA in US History here at Indiana University, and she is currently pursuing a PhD in US History with a minor in Gender Studies here at IU. Her dissertation explores the lived experiences of Black women in Indiana's rural, free Black communities, gendered experiences of freedom, and free and fugitive Black women's roles in the Underground Railroad and anti-slavery movement. And that's what she'll be telling us about today.
Thank you, Dr. Gamber. You can start the slides right now. And today's presentation will be a small part of my larger dissertation work. And the title for today is By Our Conduct and Our Action, Rural Black Women in Indiana in the First Generation of Women Suffragists, 1830 to 1865. And it's going to be a lot of reading. I apologize in advance, so if you could just stick with me. In 1863, the Students' Repository, a student periodical based out of the Union Literary Institute in Randolph County, Indiana, published an essay by a Black female scholar, Louisa D. White, titled "We Must Educate." In it, Louisa opined, quote, "Some may cry out colonization, but I say stand firm upon the land that gave us birth, and show forth to the world, by our conduct and our action, that we have the mental organs capable of improvement, sufficient to make us able to perform the duties of citizens." Louisa's essay was a bold claim for citizenship on behalf of women and the entire Black race. In her decision to avoid, quote, shrinking back from the attempt, end quote, Louisa was harnessing a powerful tool of resistance used by 3 generations of Black women in Randolph County, Indiana. In this presentation, I will highlight the ways in which Black women in Randolph County, Indiana, utilize rural Black settlements, education, and the Underground Railroad to influence national political discourse around the question of slavery, and to force local white lawmakers to grapple with Black assertions of citizenship. In doing so, free Black women created a space for themselves as political actors amongst the first generation of women suffragists in the decades leading to the end of the Civil War. Next slide. The Union Literary Institute, an integrated manual labor school, was founded in Randolph County, Indiana in 1846 by free Blacks and white Quakers from the local area. During the Civil War period, the school was operated solely by a Black school board consisting mainly of formerly enslaved people. Samuel Smothers served as principal and editor of the students' periodical, and Agnes Cotman and her husband Hiram as superintendent of the boarding house. And the records show that Agnes was the only Black woman to ever serve in any leadership position at the school. During this time, Agnes's daughters, Louisa and Lavina, were students at the school and classmates of Louisa D. White, who spoke confidently about Black women's right to citizenship in the opening quote. Amanda Way, a white Quaker from the same county, was also a student at the ULI in earlier years. In their pioneering work on the history of women's suffrage, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony will later call her, quote, the mother of the Women's Suffrage Association in Indiana, end quote. This very document became the definitive work on women's suffrage in the late 1880s, while simultaneously excluding known Black suffragists. What we know about early Black suffragists often privileges the experiences of women hailing from urban spaces in the Northeast, which leaves us little to no knowledge about Black women in the rural West, women like Agnes and her daughters, who have never been considered suffragists or activists of any kind. Next slide. The ULI's constitution stipulated that there never should be allowed in the school, its government, discipline, or privileges any distinction on the account of color, rank, or wealth. Gender, too, was no exception, which explains why Black and white children attended the school at the same time, even though Indiana laws deny Black people access to public education. In fact, these laws remained until 1869. As early as 1820, Black women were involved with securing education for their children and themselves, primarily through the aid of local Quakers. They formed these interracial collaborations in direct opposition to the Indiana State Constitution, which banned Black immigration into the state without free papers and a $500 bond guarantee of good behavior. And most people did not have $500 at that time. And also against white legislators' unwavering attempts to fund Black people's immigration to Africa. Pre-Civil War, the Indiana House of Representatives recorded frequent petitions from Black citizens throughout Indiana, demanding equal educational rights and the repeal of Black laws. The 1857 petition of Richard Robbins, Agnes's father, abolitionist, and ULI Board of Trustee, is illustrative of the concerns of Randolph County's free Black population. He wrote, quote, "We believe that the framers of the Declaration of Independence meant what they said when they declared that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We would humbly but earnestly ask you to take the necessary steps to amend the Constitution of the state, so to strike out the 13th article of the same, to repeal all laws prohibiting us from testifying in courts of justice against white men, and to give us all the political rights now guaranteed to white American citizens," end quote. Next slide. While men often held leadership positions in early Black political organizations and rarely mentioned women in their political demands, Black women were active participants in the fight for equal rights. and they shared the same sentiments and roles as their men, ones revolving around duty, political activism, and physical combat against slave catchers. Black women's activism can especially be seen in their work in the Underground Railroad. Millie Wilkerson, a Randolph County woman, in the absence of her husband, guarded her home with a corn knife and threatened to kill any slave catcher who dared enter her house in pursuit of her 2 fugitive granddaughters. Dozens of free Blacks and some local whites came to her aid, arming themselves with clubs, guns, knives, and other weapons of defense. By 1850, with the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act, armed self-resistance, violence, force would be Black abolitionists' main political tactic in their efforts to end slavery. George Chavez of the ULI stressed this in an article where he wrote, "There's an idea that some of us entertain because we had no hand in bringing ourselves into bondage, that whites are altogether to blame for our degradation. And therefore we have nothing to do but sit down upon the stool of idleness and wait for the white people to do our work, that they must free us, educate us, and in short, make us everything we should be, and we do nothing. This is a pernicious idea. We must help to free ourselves, or we will never be free," end quote. Across the 40s and 50s, while Indiana's white suffragists moved into the public sphere, joining abolitionist organizations, starting their own anti-slavery and temperance societies, and petitioning Congress for the ballot, property rights, guardianship rights, and control over their family estates, Black suffragists fought a battle on 2 fronts, advocating for women's rights while simultaneously demanding racial equality for Black folks. Next slide. Having been shut out from white women's organizations, Black women transformed homes, schools, and churches into arenas of politicization, where they gave speeches and taught their children educational, religious, and moral lessons. They aided fugitives, started their own temperance society in 1850. They made the same demands as their white female and Black male counterparts. They understood well how the double burden of racial and gender discrimination hindered their progress. I'd like to leave you with ULI scholar Lydia Steele's address to female readers. Quote, "Is this beautiful land of ours worth dying for if need be? God has called many men and women to toil and suffer and die in the world for the right. Men cannot bear the burden alone. It is our duty to sacrifice for the freedom and happiness of many," end quote. My research asks, why have rural Black women been erased from Indiana's abolitionist and suffrage history? And how can we begin to write their stories? Thank you.
Thanks, Jazma, for giving us a lot to think about. Our next speaker is Janine Giordano-Drake, who is a specialist in U.S. labor, religious, women's, cultural, and intellectual history. Janine is the author of a number of articles and book chapters, as well as a book manuscript in progress that explore the rivalries among the many social movements of the late 19th century, including the women's movement, the labor movement, the populist movement, temperance, socialism, and the social gospel. Here at IU, she splits her time between the history department and the Advanced College Project, IU's dual enrollment program in U.S. history. Welcome, Janine.
Thank you so much. This is really fun to be here today. So I have a lot to say, but in the next 5 or 7 minutes, I'll sort of encapsulate a lot of thoughts and we can talk more later. So, and we can start the slides right away. So I've been thinking a lot over the last several years about who are the people who are actually dedicated to universal suffrage in the late 19th and early 20th century. As I think our other panelists have said, this Indiana Women's Suffrage Association is formed in 1851, and it includes abolitionists and so people who are anti-racist, abolitionists, and also other people who are not really part of that abolitionist movement from the very start. In 1851, we also see the passage of the new Indiana Constitution, which severely limits Black ownership of property and cuts off Black voting rights. And this Indiana Women's Suffrage Association really is dedicating themselves to women, to women's rights to vote, and to women's opportunities for education and other such things. And while they include, as Jazma mentions, people like Amanda Way, who are part of a broader movement for Black women's rights as well. That's really not their focus, and that becomes even less of their focus as we get into the 1890s and the early 20th century, when the state becomes really overrun with KKK and lots of folks who really, really want to limit Black participation in public life, and to do so through violence and other means. So I've been thinking about who are the people who are really active in a movement for universal suffrage. And as Jazma is talking about, there are lots of Black women who are trying to get into the suffrage circles, because that was historically a movement that was really dedicated to universal suffrage, at least at certain moments. There are also other organizations, even in the state of Indiana, that I would call suffrage associations, because women's suffrage is part of their platform, even if they have other priorities. So next slide. For example, in 1898, the Social Democratic Party, which is founded in Indiana with a lot of other people, with a lot of folks who are from Indiana. They have national ambitions, of course, but Indiana is really a birthplace of the Social Democratic Party and also the Socialist Party in 1901. And in 1898, the Social Democratic Party includes in their platform statement revision of our antiquated federal constitution in order to remove the obstacles to full and complete control of government by all people irrespective of sex. And they're not just interested in supporting women's suffrage, they're also interested in this broader concept of universal suffrage. They are supportive of African-American voting rights in the state of Indiana, and that's a really big deal. It's a big threat to the Democrats and Republicans who were in government at the time, who are really trying to limit African-American voting rights and any type of labor activity. So the Social Democratic Party does organizing within heavy industry in Indiana, which is often mining, especially among African-American men and women. And they try to organize for Black men to have the right to vote, because this would not only empower the possibility of labor legislation, which would support unions in their strikes, it would also change a lot of laws and change the culture. Next slide. By 1901, and I'm sort of jumping quickly through history, by 1901, the Socialist Party of America is again founded in Indianapolis. And Eugene Debs, as a lot of us know, is a leader of this new party, and it's sort of a revision of the previous party. But again, they're dedicated to women's suffrage and to universal suffrage overall. Again, in 1901, they're dedicated to Black men's rights, and and to the possibility of universal suffrage in a much broader way than just women's suffrage organizations. So I've been thinking about the Socialist Party as a suffrage association, as a suffrage organization. And I can tell you a little bit about what the Socialist Party themselves are doing. And I see them really as an Indiana organization, because they're really running themselves out of Eugene Debs' Terre Haute. So in 1912, the Socialist Party forms the Women's National Committee, which is a very large, it has ambitions to be a very large organization, which has chapters within every state with a bunch of stump speakers in every state, whose job it is to not only register people as Socialist Party members, but also register people as potential voters. So they're interested in this broad idea of universal suffrage for working men and women, African American and white and ethnic of all types. And they're interested in the possibility of universal suffrage. They have national publications, for example, the Progressive Woman, and the Progressive Woman is basically edited by lots of women socialist feminists who are national speakers and writers about socialism. And they often, if you read through the magazines, they often talk about the problems of wives as being sort of slaves of their husbands, but also slaves of their husbands' employers. And within the state of Indiana, we have a very large sort of subset of people who work for the Women's National Committee, called the Women's Bureau. And I'm going to use the rest of my time to talk about a little about the Women's Bureau in the state of Indiana and the women who are organizing for basically the Socialist Party, for universal suffrage, and eventually actually for the ratification of the 19th Amendment here in Indiana. So first, I found Lilith Martin. Lilith Martin is born in Dublin, Indiana. She gets married in Anderson, Indiana, and she spends much of her life after 1912 there. She is the chief women's correspondent for the state, which means she reports directly to this Women's National Committee. Under her leadership, her committee, which includes lots of other team members, so to speak, collects about 5,000 signatures from people in the state of Indiana who are in favor of the ratification of this 19th Amendment. And she's often trying to collect these signatures among what we would call today unregistered voters. She's collecting these signatures among immigrants, among African Americans, and among women, and she's inviting them into these meetings where they will discuss socialism, mothers' pensions, which is basically a form of Social Security for women who don't have another income in the family, education for women, which for her not only includes this professional education, classical education that a lot of upper class women suffragists are asking for, but opportunities for working women to get skilled access to being part of the skilled trade so they can be paid more, and ultimately equal pay for equal work so they can be in some of these skilled trades that a lot of their husbands are working in. And education more broadly to just be part of the public school systems. Believe it or not, a lot of these women are really interested in public school as a very political thing. So a lot of these women are also involved in school boards and superintendent of schools types of work. Lilith Martin is part of this Women's Bureau for several years, and after the passage of the amendment, she actually goes on into elected politics for the rest of her life. Next slide. Rosa Lenhard is also working with Lilith Martin and this broader team for the Women's Bureau. She is also one of these people who tries to work with women who are in the trades throughout the state of Indiana. And believe it or not, in the state of Indiana, we have several thousand women who are working outside the home in the trades in this period, 1910. I counted around 5,000 women according to the data from 1919. We have about 2,000 women working in textiles, 1,000 in food products, at that time often things like canning, and 1,000 in drugs, likely for Eli Lilly. And she is one of those people who is traveling around and trying to get these women into communities where they can talk with one another, talk about their problems, things that we think about as 1970s consciousness raising, but really is pioneered here, and perhaps it's not even the first time, of getting these women into communities and getting them registered both for the Socialist Party and for their support for this 19th Amendment. Finally, next slide. I want to talk about Florence Waddles. Oh yes, these are the things that we mentioned. These are the things that they always are emphasizing. Next slide after this. Finally, Florence Waddles. Florence Waddles I know the most about, and I was very excited to find her picture eventually. She's 29 years old when she does a lot of this work for the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And she actually gets called out. She gets a line in Elizabeth Cady Stanton's official History of Women's Suffrage. So she is also within this Women's Bureau, and she's traveling around a lot. I found evidence of her in many cities in the state of Indiana. And she especially tries to work with organized men in the trades in the state of Indiana, and to get their unions to officially support women's suffrage. So these are AFL unions, these are miners of all different types. And she is not only organizing women, but she's organizing working class men to be both socialists and supporters of universal suffrage. And she's called out, she must have relationships, I know, with people in the Indiana Women's Suffrage Association, because she gets called out as an ally in this formal reflection on how Indiana got the right to vote. And she eventually gets the unanimous resolution of, as what I can tell, it's not identified as the American Federation of Labor, but of most trade unionists in the state. And she gets 1,600 delegates to support the the possibility of women's suffrage. So she forwards these names and these signatures to the state, and on behalf, she is the one who collects them, or she's the one who gets credit for them, and forwards them back to the Indiana Women's Suffrage Association as evidence that the people in the state of Indiana want the state to ratify this 19th Amendment. Okay, thank you much. And that's about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Janine. So last but not least, we have Lisa Marie Napoli, who you've already met. Lisa Marie received her MPA in Public Policy and Management from the Ohio State University and her doctoral degree in Public Affairs here at IU. She currently is the director of the Political and Civic Engagement Program, otherwise known as PACE, the co-chair of IU's Big Ten Voting Challenge, and founding director of PACE's Talk Democracy Project. Lisa Marie has several publications on public engagement and is trained as a mediator, facilitator, researcher, public engagement consultant, and pracademic. She enjoys working collaboratively with other campus units, community members, and students to bring theory to practice. Take it away, Lisa Marie.
Great, thank you so much. Oh my gosh, I've been in such listening mode to these great historical stories. Could do that all day. So thanks to each of you for setting such a great stage for the research work that you've done. And also I just want to give a quick shout out to Carrie Champion, director of the Wiley House, for designing and organizing us to have this panel today. Just a little shout out there. So I'll just briefly set a context. I know we have some time limits to be able to get a question or two in at the end. PACE, the program in general, our motto is to bring theory to practice. So my goal for this brief talk today is to take a lot of this historical information, highlight a few nuggets of the suffrage movement, and put that into an action-oriented thing of what we're doing here at IU. So we could pull up the slides, please. And so I just want to highlight the people that have been mentioned, the interest and the activity in the women's suffrage movement. Thank you all for putting that in perspective in Monroe County, Randolph County, and around Indiana. Okay, so next slide. So we know, right? The journey's been long. That's what we're here today to talk about, is looking at the 100 years and even recognizing the sacrifices made before, during, and after, and they continue today, as we know also clearly. But it's important to recognize that each generation continues to face these challenges about women's equality issues, whether it's equal pay, equal worth, equal representation. There's just a myriad of issues. And what's really exciting to me, being at IU as director of the PACE program and a faculty member, is the fact that we could work with students who are so amazing in having awareness about systemic issues, having awareness about their capacity as citizens, the importance of their voice, and how to put that into action. So we'll talk about that. Next slide. So I'm very inspired when I hear about the stories of Black women in the cause and how they were juggling not only the suffrage cause, but so many other issues that I think Jazma and Janine pointed out so well about racial inequities. So I just want to make sure we continue to keep that as at the forefront of anything we do when we talk about women's equality, because as we know, gender issues and racial issues are so intertwined and different in many ways and so similar too. And I'm so glad to see the names and photos of many of these women, and there's so many more to mention. Just want to throw in Fannie Lou Hamer, who is a civil rights activist for voting rights, and she has such a powerful story. And for National Voter Registration Day coming up in September, we'll talk more about her. But there's a lot of work to look at this history, acknowledge the truth, and do some healing from the injustices. So, okay, next slide. Yeah, voter suppression, my goodness, it continues, right? We're hearing about it historically. We're hearing about how hard it was to get there. And my goodness, it keeps on going. So some of it's subtle, right? And some of it's really obvious. But we really need to look at the voting rights in our country. And Lisa Tetro has some great pieces out that she's written about. She came to our sex, race, and voting rights class last night to get us to think about more fully what is going on with voting rights, and to look at the obstacles we have, whether it's you know, the trying to keep people from being able to have access in several ways, whether that's mail-in ballots. We have issues currently with the United States Postal Service. There's gerrymandering issues. There's restrictions in voting hours. There's just a lot of work that needs to be done in Indiana and across the country. And we work closely with the Monroe County Election board and the supervisor here locally, and it's been awesome to keep removing those barriers and doing all we can to try to make voting rights work well in our community. So next slide, please. All right, so let's look at it here at IU. The Big Ten Voting Challenge, which has been super exciting here to have at IU. We saw an increase in our last presidential election with student voter turnout, and that's been really exciting. So there's a PACE student who spoke on the student panel on Monday, Cassidy McCammon, talking a little bit about the Big Ten Voting Challenge, and I'd like to say a few more words about it. What we do, it's a campus-wide effort. So grateful for all the programs and departments and units, you know, Department of Political Science, Office of First Year Experience, just so many more to mention. But the Office of the Provost, IU President's Office, and IU Student Government have been crucial players as well in helping to make this happen, along with PACE at the helm. So voter registration, our goal is 100% voter registration. Mark Fraley's at the front of that, helping us to make that happen. We're working very hard for nonpartisan voter education to make sure that we take that approach and we let students know about the process of voting as well as the issues to be informed to move forward and cast their votes without any obstacles. Voter turnout, we want to get people to the polls and support that process. And then talk democracy is very much about having conversations where we can be open, challenge each other, and make sure that we discuss the important issues about the issues out there in the world, the public issues, as well as the public issue about the voting process. So there's our Big Ten Voting Challenge website you might want to check out. Next slide. All right, so connecting with students, listening to student ideas about how to enhance voter registration has been such a core for the work that we do for the PACE program, as well as for the Big Ten Voting Challenge. So we collaborate with student groups. I remember a representative from IU Student Government mentioning a year or so ago, a couple of years ago, like they haven't collaborated so fully with any academic units as they've done with us. So that's exciting. Having student input makes all the difference in the world. Again, I mentioned our student voter registration goal. You know, we want to get there as close as we can. Maybe not 100%, but we're going to get there as far as we can. And just remembering that a voice and a vote for traditionally underrepresented groups is key. And so we're reaching out to traditionally underrepresented student groups and making sure that we could work with them and have a voice and tap into that population to be able that they can be educated to vote in. They are, and we want to make sure everyone is. So I think the last slide now to wrap it up. Oh, 2 more slides. Okay, so these are just important dates, locally speaking, for Indiana folks to remember. Just want to point out on that October 22nd date, if you want to request a mail-in ballot form, it must be received by that date, not postmarked, but received. So other than that, you can find all this information online. All right, and last slide to wrap it up. Yeah, so we want everyone, mostly our focus is students, but we want everyone to make sure that we participate fully in democracy. You know, talk democracy with family and friends, test out ways to share ideas, whether they're similar or different. Do your research. You know, in the PACE program, we like to say from the courthouse to the White House for this November election. It's all very important. And empower student voices, whether that's your own as a student, whether if you're a faculty, staff, or administrator. How can you best support students to empower their voice and their ability to vote? So that's all. Thank you so much. And hopefully we'll have time for a question to wrap up.
Thanks so much, Janine. Well, I'm hoping we'll get some questions from the audience, but I would like to start us off with one, and that is, how might the evidence you've collectively uncovered in these fascinating presentations change our perception of Indiana history, Indiana University history, and Monroe County history?
Well, I'll start. I think that in everybody's remarks, I think that it's very clear that it wasn't only just these big names that we have heard about that were involved in the movement. There were people involved at every level, working on behalf of women. And I think that that was definitely represented in the remarks today.
I would agree with that. I think that that was something that I was really excited to learn about, is that it's everyday people, everyday women in our community, that even the small communities. I found out that Harrodsburg, like, we know how small Harrodsburg is in Monroe County. They had their own franchise league just for Harrodsburg. So I thought, I was like, wow, that's wonderful. That, I mean, and maybe it was like 10 people, but still, it's like they were passionate enough and interested enough that they formed their own league. And so I just thought that that was something that I was really excited to learn, that it wasn't just Susan B. Anthony that was championing this cause. It was the women of Harrodsburg as well.
And I'll go ahead and echo what everyone else has already said, just finding the pictures and the names to a lot of these women who, for one, I didn't know exist for like 3 years of doing my research, and then finally being able to find their actual words and writing. And for historians who study Black women in this time period, I think that's very important. So my findings not only have changed the way we think about Indiana's history, moving beyond the fact that they were there, which is important to acknowledge first, because if you go to traditional archives, you will be led to believe that they did not live in these places. And then moving beyond that is thinking about how we do research on these women. And for me, it has been moving beyond traditional archives. I was not able to find them in historical societies. They were not reenacted at historic homes on the Underground Railroad. Where I found them was through the direction and the guidance of their descendants in the archives and the things that they have preserved over time. So a part of my research has been not only thinking about the ways in which they shape Indiana's history and various historiographies when you bring them in, but also how we can tell their stories with so little sources, or with thinking that we have so many sources, but the sources are there, just like hidden and like preserved in plain sight.
And just to add, I don't know if Janine wanted to jump in too, but I think the bottom line of so much of this is when we hear these stories, to not take anything for granted, to be able to know that, especially as a woman, when we cast that vote, like, wow, what it took to get there. So I appreciate knowing the names more and talking about them and getting them to our younger generation to know and understand and have that be a part of our history in more significant ways. So.
We have a question from the audience, which is a really interesting one. The question is, as a feminist artist, I am wondering about women artists' role in the Indiana suffrage movement. Anybody know anything about that? It's a great question.
I do know that in the parades that they had for women's suffrage, they had artistic tableaus, I think was the word they used, where they would like stage themselves as sculptures to convey a message. And I have seen a lot of comics and art in that way, through words and images that were more kind of lighthearted and fun. I'm sure there's a lot more. And we do have a yellow art rose exhibit that's going to be digitally around campus today. Just want to mention that. So that's a current thing. Thanks for that support to happen.
Okay, one more question very quickly. Would any of the historians here want to comment with a future-looking opinion about the ratification of the ERA?
I don't have any comment about, I wouldn't know how to comment on that, but related to that, I've thought a lot about if I think about telling the story of women's suffrage in the state of Indiana, I feel like there's a different story about how women tried to get the right to vote in the state than the story of how and why the state ratified the National Amendment. And I think it's important to think about how these are actually, they're related, but they're really two different stories. And I think Lisa Marie is really pointing on that national politics and the ratification of a constitutional amendment really involves different strategies and different types of work, like more cultural work, more really changing the way people think about things than the particular strategies of getting something passed as like the Master-McKinley Act, which someone mentioned, Hilary mentioned, about literally getting a state law passed. So this is not really a helpful comment perhaps, but I've grown an appreciation through some of this research on the very different ways you have to tell a story with necessity of different strategies.
Thank you. Well, we have come to the end of our time. In fact, we're a bit over time, so I think we need to close. But I'd like to thank our wonderful panelists and to thank the audience for spending their lunch hour with us. And finally, I'd like to remind you that information for IU Equality programming and other events related to the 19th Amendment Centennial can be found on IU's 19th Amendment website page, which is go.iu.edu/19A. So happy Equality Day and enjoy your afternoon. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.